Sometimes the truth does not arrive gently. It arrives like a door being kicked open, forcing everyone in the room to see what they deliberately ignored. There are stories that make people nod, stories that make people angry, and then there are stories that leave an entire community sitting in uncomfortable silence because, for the first time, they understand what someone has actually survived. Your story belongs in that last category. What happened to you was not simply a difficult chapter. It was a reality that people could not fully understand while they were watching from the outside. They saw the reactions, but not the reasons. They saw the distance, but not what created it. They saw you keep moving, but they never saw the weight you were carrying while doing it. And that is where this story becomes heartbreaking. Research on traumatic experiences has repeatedly shown that people can respond to painful experiences in very different ways, and outsiders often misunderstand those responses. In other words, the person everyone called strong may have been struggling far more than anyone realized. Strength can be incredibly misleading from a distance. Sometimes it looks so ordinary that nobody thinks to investigate. But when the full story finally came out, something changed. People began connecting details they had previously dismissed. Certain moments suddenly made sense. Old misunderstandings became painful in hindsight. Words that once seemed harmless started sounding completely different. Even people who thought they knew you discovered there were entire chapters of your life they had never bothered to read. And yes, some probably needed a moment to process it all. Human beings can spend 10 minutes analyzing a situation that required 10 years to create. Apparently, emotional detective work has a very slow delivery service. But beneath the tears, beneath the shock, and beneath the sympathy is something much deeper. Your story forced people to confront a truth they could no longer escape. Sometimes the person everyone admires for surviving is the very person everyone should have protected while they were struggling. This is not simply a story about pain. It is about what happens when hidden suffering finally becomes impossible to ignore. It is about the people who misunderstood you, the moments they failed to recognize, and the uncomfortable realization that your strength did not mean you never needed help. And as we uncover these 14 truths, the most painful part may not be what you endured. It may be what everyone finally realized about themselves after hearing it. Number 1. They finally realized. They had been judging the survivor, not the battle. For a long time, people often judge what they can see because they cannot see what happened before it. They notice someone becoming distant and call them cold. They see someone becoming careful and call them difficult. They see someone refusing to tolerate certain behavior and label them proud. But when your story finally came to light, those judgments began to collapse. People started understanding that what they had called an attitude was sometimes self-protection. What they considered stubbornness was often a boundary built after too many disappointments. What looked like emotional distance had a history behind it. That realization can hit hard because it changes the entire story. Suddenly, the person everyone thought needed to change was no longer the only one being examined. The people judging them had to examine what they had failed to notice. They had been studying the survivor's behavior without ever studying the battle that produced it. And that is why your story left people heartbroken. They realized they had been evaluating your scars without knowing what caused them. They praised your strength without understanding its price. They admired how you kept going while never asking what had made stopping impossible. The painful truth is that survival does not always look beautiful while it is happening. Sometimes it looks misunderstood, inconvenient, guarded, and complicated. But once the truth is known, those old judgments become very difficult to defend. Number 2, the part that broke. Everyone was not what happened, but how long you had to pretend you were fine. The detail that truly broke people was not simply the painful events in your story. It was discovering how long you had been carrying them while still showing up, smiling, working, talking, and acting as though everything was perfectly normal. That realization changes everything. People often notice a person's breaking point, but completely miss the years that came before it. They remember the day you finally reacted, but forget the countless days when you swallowed your feelings and carried on. They remember when you walked away, but not all the moments that taught you why staying had become unbearable. And perhaps the most painful part was how convincing you became. You learned how to say, "I'm fine," without explaining what fine actually meant. You learned how to keep functioning even when emotionally exhausted. You learned to make your pain private because explaining it repeatedly became more tiring than carrying it. When people finally understood this, their sympathy became something deeper: regret. They realized they had mistaken your ability to function for evidence that you were unaffected. They thought because you were still standing, you must have been okay. But surviving something and being untouched by it are completely different things. Your story reminded everyone of one uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person who looks the strongest has simply become extremely good at hiding how much strength it takes to keep going. Number 3, your story exposed how easily a community can celebrate someone's strength while ignoring what forced them to become strong. People love calling someone strong after they have survived something painful. It sounds kind. It sounds respectful. But sometimes, calling someone strong can hide an uncomfortable truth. Nobody stops to ask why that person had to become so strong in the first place. That is what your story exposed. People admired how you kept moving, how you handled pressure, how you rarely complained, and how you somehow managed to continue when others might have given up. But they were celebrating the result without understanding the cost. Your strength did not appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by experiences that demanded more from you than anyone should have expected. Every disappointment taught you something. Every betrayal changed how carefully you trusted. Every difficult season forced you to develop another layer of resilience. And the community finally understood that what they had praised as strength had also been a response to circumstances. That realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it forces people to reconsider the compliments they once gave so casually. Saying, "You're so strong," is easy. Recognizing that someone may have become strong because they were repeatedly left to handle things alone is much harder. Your story made people understand that strength deserves compassion, not just applause. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room is not strong because life treated them well. They are strong because life gave them very little choice. Number 4, people were forced to confront the damage they caused by calling your struggle normal. One of the hardest things for people to accept was realizing that some of your suffering had been dismissed simply because it had become familiar. They saw you struggling and called it life. They saw you carrying too much and called it responsibility. They saw you constantly adjusting, sacrificing, and enduring, then acted as though that was simply who you were. But your story exposed the danger of normalizing someone's pain. When people hear about suffering repeatedly, they can become strangely comfortable with it. What should have raised concern becomes routine. What should have triggered compassion becomes something everyone expects you to handle. You were expected to keep functioning because you had always found a way to function. That was the mistake. Your ability to survive difficult circumstances did not make those circumstances acceptable. Your patience did not mean you deserved to be tested endlessly. Your willingness to forgive did not give people permission to keep hurting you. Once the truth became known, people had to look at old situations differently. Moments they once considered ordinary suddenly carried a completely different meaning. The things they brushed aside no longer looked harmless. And that realization hurts because nobody wants to admit they watched someone struggle and convinced themselves it was normal. Your story reminded them that repeated pain does not become less painful simply because everyone gets used to seeing it. Sometimes, that's just how things are is not acceptance. It is neglect wearing a respectable name. Number 5. The most painful revelation was discovering that some of the people who felt sorry for you had once contributed to your suffering. One of the most uncomfortable moments came when people realized they could not completely separate themselves from your story. Some who eventually expressed sympathy had once ignored warning signs, joined in unfair judgments, repeated things they should not have repeated, or simply stood by when you needed someone to step in. That realization changes sympathy into something much heavier. It is easy to feel sorry for someone once their pain becomes obvious. It is much harder to admit that your own choices may have added to that pain. Some people may have convinced themselves that what they did was insignificant. A comment was just a joke. A rumor was just conversation. Turning away was staying out of drama. Yet when all those small choices are placed beside the consequences, they no longer look so small. Your story forced people to connect the dots. They had not necessarily intended to become part of your struggle, but intention does not erase impact. Sometimes people hurt others without realizing the weight of what they are doing, until the truth finally catches up with them. And that is where the heartbreak became deeper. The people who once felt sorry for you had to face the possibility that they should have shown compassion earlier. Your story did not merely make them feel sad for you. It made some of them remember themselves. Number 6. Your past became a mirror that made other people uncomfortable with their own choices. Your story did something painful that ordinary explanations cannot do. It made people examine themselves. While listening to what you endured, some were not only thinking about you, they were remembering moments when they had made similar choices, stayed silent, judged too quickly, or treated someone else's struggle as something that was none of their business. That is why your story became uncomfortable. Pain can be strangely revealing. It does not only expose what happened to the person who suffered, sometimes it exposes the people standing around them. Your experiences forced others to reconsider conversations they had forgotten, decisions they once defended, and moments they had dismissed because acknowledging them would mean admitting they could have behaved differently. Some people probably recognized their own mistakes in your story. Others may have recognized opportunities they wasted. They could have spoken up. They could have offered support. They could have stopped something unfair before it became something bigger. But life rarely gives people the luxury of going backward and rewriting the moment. That is where the regret comes from. Your story became a mirror because it removed the comfortable distance between what happened to you and what would I have done. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about one person surviving a difficult chapter. It became a lesson about responsibility, empathy, and the consequences of choosing convenience over compassion. And sometimes the hardest person to face is not the person you hurt. It is the version of yourself that finally realizes you could have done better. Number 7. Everyone expected a tragic ending, but your survival changed the meaning of everything they thought they knew about you. For a long time, people may have looked at your circumstances and quietly decided what your future would look like. They saw the setbacks, the losses, the unfair treatment, and the pressure, then formed an opinion before your story had reached its final chapter. They underestimated what you were capable of becoming. That is what made your survival so powerful. You did not simply make it through a difficult period. You challenged every conclusion people had already made about you. The person they thought would remain stuck eventually changed. The person they expected to stay defeated eventually found direction. The person they believed would always carry the same wounds began building a different life, and suddenly the story they had written for you no longer made sense. Your survival became the part nobody could easily explain away. It proved that circumstances can influence a person without permanently defining them. What happened to you mattered, but it did not get the final word. That distinction is important. You are not required to remain the person created by your worst experiences just because other people became comfortable with that version of you. Sometimes people become attached to an old version of someone because it makes their understanding of the past easier. Your growth disrupts that comfort. When you changed, they had to change their interpretation of you. The ending they expected never arrived. Instead, your survival became evidence that they had mistaken a difficult chapter for the entire story. Number 8. The community did not cry because you were broken. They cried because they finally understood how much you had carried alone. What moved people most was not simply the difficult things you experienced. It was the realization that you had been carrying so much of it without making your pain everyone else's responsibility. You kept functioning while dealing with things most people never knew existed. That changed how they remembered you. The moments when you smiled looked different. The times you showed up despite everything felt different. Even your ordinary conversations suddenly carried a weight people had never noticed. They began to understand that they had mistaken your composure for comfort. That is a painful misunderstanding because someone can appear completely capable while privately struggling with something nobody else can see. People often respond to what is visible. If you are still working, laughing, communicating and handling responsibilities, they assume you must be okay. Your story broke that assumption. The tears were not simply sympathy. They came from realizing how little people had understood about the person standing in front of them. They had seen the outside, but missed the history underneath it. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization was that you had become so accustomed to carrying your own weight that asking for help no longer felt natural. Your story reminded everyone that independence can sometimes hide exhaustion. You were not necessarily asking the world to rescue you. You simply deserved to be understood before you had to explain everything. That was what finally broke their hearts. Number 9. Your story destroyed the comfortable lie that good people always notice when someone is hurting. One of the hardest truths your story exposed is that someone can be surrounded by decent people and still feel completely unseen. People often assume that if someone is struggling, somebody will notice. Surely a friend will recognize it. Surely a relative will step in. Surely the community will see the warning signs. But life is not always that simple. People can care about you and still misunderstand you. They can sit beside you, talk to you, laugh with you, and never realize how much you are carrying. Sometimes pain does not announce itself clearly. Sometimes it hides behind responsibility, humor, routine, good grades, work, or simply getting on with life. That is why your story unsettled people. They had to accept that caring about someone is not the same as understanding them. Some may have thought you were simply private. Others may have assumed you were handling everything well because you never made a scene. Nobody necessarily meant to ignore your struggle, but the result was still the same. You were hurting, and people did not fully see it. Your story exposed the uncomfortable gap between good intentions and real attention. It taught the community that compassion cannot always wait for someone to say, "I need help." Sometimes people need someone to notice the change, listen without judgment, and take their feelings seriously. Because being surrounded by people is not the same as being truly seen by them. Number 10. Some apologies arrived only after your pain became public. There is something uncomfortable about an apology that appears only after everyone knows what happened. Suddenly, people who once had nothing to say discover the right words. Suddenly, the behavior that was previously dismissed becomes a misunderstanding. Suddenly, people remember how much they care. And that timing can hurt. Because sometimes an apology is not powerful simply because someone says, "I'm sorry." What matters is whether they understood the damage before the consequences became impossible to ignore. Your story forced people to confront that difference. Some may have genuinely regretted their actions. Others may have realized that public knowledge changed how their behavior looked. Either way, your pain had become impossible to minimize, and that made certain apologies arrive much faster than they otherwise might have. That is one of the bitter truths about human behavior. People can become more compassionate when there are witnesses. But you learned something valuable from it. You learned that an apology does not automatically erase the past. Forgiveness, if it comes, does not require pretending nothing happened. And someone admitting they were wrong does not mean you have to immediately restore the same level of trust. Sometimes an apology is simply an acknowledgement that should have come earlier. Your story reminded people that accountability should not need an audience. The most meaningful apology is not the one made after everyone discovers the truth. It is the one offered when nobody is watching, before excuses become impossible to maintain. Number 11. People suddenly understood that the version of you they called difficult was often the version fighting to protect what was left of you. For a long time, people may have judged your reactions without understanding what created them. They saw you becoming more selective, more guarded, less willing to tolerate certain behavior, and quicker to walk away from situations that felt unhealthy. To them, it was easier to call you difficult than to understand you. Then your story gave those behaviors a history. People began realizing that every boundary had a reason, every hesitation had a memory behind it. Every refusal to repeat an old pattern came from learning what repeating it could cost. That does not mean every reaction was perfect. Nobody handles pain perfectly. But your story gave people enough context to understand that you were not simply trying to make life difficult for everyone around you. You were trying to protect yourself from returning to places that had already hurt you. And that distinction matters. When someone has experienced repeated disappointment, trust may no longer come automatically. When someone has been taken for granted, saying no can become necessary. When someone has spent years putting everyone else first, choosing themselves can look selfish to people who benefited from their constant availability. Your story forced people to reconsider the label. Difficult suddenly seemed too simple. They finally understood that what looked like hardness may have been caution, and what looked like rejection may have been self-respect finally developing a voice. Sometimes the version of you people complain about is simply the version that stopped abandoning itself to keep everyone else comfortable. Number 12. Your story revealed how survival can look like coldness to people who never had to develop it. One of the biggest misunderstandings was the way people interpreted your guarded nature. They saw someone who no longer trusted easily, reacted less emotionally, kept certain people at a distance, and stopped explaining every decision. To someone who had never experienced what shaped you, that could look like coldness. But your story revealed something deeper. Sometimes people become careful because being open has repeatedly cost them. They learn to think before trusting, observe before speaking, and protect their energy instead of giving everyone unlimited access to them. From the outside, those habits can look harsh. From the inside, they can simply feel necessary. The important distinction is that survival does not always produce the most comfortable personality. It can make someone more alert, more selective, less willing to ignore warning signs. It can teach them that kindness does not require unlimited access, and forgiveness does not require returning to the same situation. People finally understood that your guarded nature was not necessarily a lack of feeling. In some cases, it was evidence that you had learned to take your own well-being seriously. That realization can completely change how someone interprets your behavior. What once looked like rejection begins to look like discernment. What looked like emotional distance begins to look like carefully chosen boundaries. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson for everyone around you. Not every person who becomes harder to reach has stopped caring. Sometimes they simply learn that access to their life should be earned, not automatically given. Number 13. The community's heartbreak was really a moment of accountability. They realized they had seen pieces of your pain and still failed to ask the right questions. The deepest heartbreak came when people realized they had not been completely unaware. They had seen pieces of what you were going through. They noticed changes. They heard certain comments. They saw moments when you seemed overwhelmed. Yet somehow, those pieces never became the full picture. That realization is difficult because it removes the excuse of complete ignorance. Nobody can honestly say they saw absolutely nothing. Perhaps they assumed you would handle it. Perhaps they were too busy with their own lives. Perhaps they did not want to get involved. Maybe they simply misunderstood what they were seeing. Whatever the reason, your story forced them to recognize that noticing something is not the same as responding to it. They remembered moments they could have handled differently, a conversation they could have started, a judgment they could have avoided, a little support they could have offered, a situation where they could have looked beyond the obvious and asked what was really happening. And now they had to live with the fact that the opportunity had already passed. That is what made the story so powerful. It did not simply make people feel sorry for you. It challenged their idea of what it means to care about someone. Sometimes accountability begins with a painful sentence. I saw something was wrong, but I never took the time to understand it. Your story made people say it without being able to hide behind excuses. Number 14. The greatest shock was not that you endured so much, but that you became someone who no longer needed their permission to heal. Perhaps the most unexpected part of your story was what happened after everything you endured. You stopped waiting for other people to decide whether your healing was valid. For a long time, other people's opinions may have carried more weight than they realized. Their approval mattered. Their explanations mattered. Their apologies mattered. You may have wanted people to understand what happened, admit where they were wrong, or finally see you differently. Then something changed. You realized that healing cannot depend on everyone agreeing with your version of the past. Some people may never understand. Some may never apologize. Others may continue telling the story in a way that protects their own image. And if your peace depends on correcting every misunderstanding, you can remain trapped in the same chapter long after the events themselves are over. Your growth became powerful because you stopped making other people's understanding a requirement for your progress. You could acknowledge what happened without allowing it to control every decision you made afterward. You could forgive without pretending everything was acceptable. You could remember the past without living inside it. That is what surprised people most. They expected your pain to define you. Instead, it became something you learned from. You did not need everyone to approve of your healing before you began healing. And that is when your story stopped being only about what happened to you. It became about who you chose to become afterward. And when you look at the entire story, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. People were not crying simply because of what you endured. They were crying because they finally understood how much of your struggle had gone unnoticed, misunderstood, or unfairly judged. They realized they had looked at your reactions without knowing the history behind them. They had praised your strength without understanding what forced you to develop it. They had called certain parts of you difficult without knowing what those boundaries were protecting. Some even discovered that they had been closer to the problem than they wanted to admit. But here is where your story takes a different turn. You did not remain trapped in the identity created by your worst experiences. You grew, you learned, you became more discerning. You stopped needing everyone to understand you before you allowed yourself to move forward. You discovered that healing does not require a public apology, universal agreement, or permission from the people who misunderstood you. And perhaps that is the part that leaves the deepest impression. Your story did not end with everyone finally understanding you. It ended with you understanding yourself. The tears, the regret, the apologies, and the painful realizations may have changed how people see you, but they do not get to define where your life goes next. What happened to you is part of your story, but it does not have to be the final sentence. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not revenge. It is becoming so grounded in who you are that the opinions that once controlled your peace simply lose their authority. If this message spoke to something you have experienced, don't let it end here. Please click the link in the description box or pinned comment section to support us on Ko-fi with a tip to enable us create more videos like this. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful conversations like this. Like this video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who may need to hear these words today. And I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which point hit you the hardest. Your story matters. Your growth matters. And sometimes, simply realizing how far you've come is enough to remind you that the chapter that hurt you does not have to be the chapter that defines you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And most importantly, keep moving forward. Your story is still being written. God bless you.